Morning, good afternoon to everybody. My name is Janira Arias. I'm the leadership organizer and advocacy for Alianza Americas. I am welcoming you to this conversation in which we will be discussing with Oscar Chacón, Alianza Americas Executive Director, with regards to the migration relief prospects for with what's remaining for 2024 and what are the perspectives for uh, migratory relief for the next 4 years. We will briefly share with you, for those who wish to listen to this conversation in English, we have interpretation available. All you have to do is look at the bottom part of your screen and select your preferred language. I'm going to say it in English for those who haven't selected it.
Arias, the leadership and advocacy organizer. If you would like to listen to this conversation in English, please look into the bottom part of your screen and select the language of your preference. This conversation will be conducted in Spanish. Y damos la bienvenida a Oscar, que es...
And we welcome Oscar, who is the co-founder and executive director
múltiples roles de
for
liderazgo.
Americas. Oscar has had many leadership roles in several organizations, starting from the 1980s. And throughout his life, he has worked in multidisciplinary processes which explore the relationship between the economic policy, cultural changes, social well-being, the construction of democracy, international policy, and human mobility from a transnational perspective. In the migratory topic, Oscar has been a critical voice of the United States migration policy, and he proposes and a proponent of a way to advance that allows to dismount the policy, which is deeply racist and xenophobic, which is still the law of the nation of the United States of America, and to produce tangible benefits which would improve the lives of the migrant people and their families. So, welcome, Oscar. A brief introduction before we begin talking with Oscar, what we're going to be reflecting on during the next hours, and also how the agenda is going to be structured. At the end of the 1950s, the US would allow the entry to almost 500,000 migrants, majority of Mexican, throughout the year, of which 450,000 of these entered with a temporary work permit, and 50,000 of them arrived with a permanent resident visas. During the middle of the 1960s, a change in the United States migratory policies reflected part of the struggle of the civil rights, including that the number of quota or entry of people based on their nationality was eliminated because it considered that they were racist criteria. So the number of opportunities was drastically reduced for regularized entry to United States. The number of temporary work permits was also regulated and also went down to 20,000 for permanent visas. With much more restricted entry to the United States, the migratory flow simply continued. These established limits were what began an unexpected chain reaction of events that culminated in a total war against the immigrant people, a policy that is highly punitive, and the unprecedented rapid growth of undocumented people living in the US, the increase of number of people of unauthorized people within the United States, and the growth of the undocumented population are a product of migratory policies that are ill-conceived by all the administrations of both major parties in the US. In today's conversation, we're going to reflect on the impact that this historic legacy has had on any attempt to provide migratory relief to people from Latin America. We're going to have three questions to better understand the influence of these factors that shape the positioning of the federal government on the migration of people coming from Latin America. I'm going to moderate this conversation, and they're going to move on to reflect on a second topic, which is on the agenda, since it has to do with migratory relief, which is something that has been announced. It's going to be named parole in place or a permit, temporary permit to understand the relationship that exists between the recently announced measure by President Biden to provide opportunities for regularized permanency for certain migratory people and the weight that these at the 60 years of this migratory policy that it has, seeing as it's failed. This is going to be moderated by our colleague Elena Olea. And after this, we're going to open a space for question and answer from the audience. Having said all this, Oscar, once again, welcome. And the first question for you, the US is currently immersed in a with a lot of xenophobia, the bills of law that are implemented to penalize and exclude immigrant people who have been presented by state legislations. They have increased in the last 30 years. And the Congress of the US has triplicated the federal budget assigned to restrict the number of people of migratory people and increase the infrastructure for detention and deportation of people who don't have a migratory status. And at the same time, for almost 40 years, they haven't legislated to offer means for people who want to enter or already live in the US. Please explain, Oscar, how the policies that have been promoted in the 60s in the US drastically reduce the legal entry routes and to stay within the US in general terms, and people from Mexican nationalities in particular. First of all, thank you, Janita, and good afternoon and morning to everybody who is joining us. I think that it's important to understand that what happened not only in the US, but also throughout the entire world, is that starting basically in 1970, to focus on a specific year, the nature of the migratory flow of human beings throughout the world changed until 1970. The common profile of the person that was migrating, that left their country of origin to another one, was dominated by people that were mainly European. They were white skinned, and in the case of the US, that was definitely the case. What happened starting in 1970 is that migratory changes completely, and the people coming from the Latin America and the Caribbean, in particular Mexico, becomes much more numerous. And it was curious because the change in the law in 1965 was in theory motivated by to surpass what had been a law that was clearly racist. The US law from beginning from the previous century until 1965 was a law that was clearly favored migration from European countries, which obviously worked against other minorities, ethnic and racial minorities. But what happens is that when this change occurs, we're talking 1970 on, something that was done with a good intention, which was to provide equal opportunities to the different groups that were arriving in the US, is that a bottleneck is created. And in this bottleneck, by the end of the 1970s, we could not obtain more than 20,000 immigrant visas per year for any specific country, including Mexico. And I'm also including other countries within the American continent. And I repeat, this had a positive motivation. It began, I insist, in a bottleneck that it meant that every year, the number of requests would increase because of family ties or work ties. And I'm talking about permanent resident visas, and they entered a waiting pattern. And this at the same time caused that for many people that knew that eventually they were going to have access to an immigrant visa or a permanent resident visa, took the decision to come to the US and stay living here while they waited, because waiting for their visa to be available. So it's important to remember that in 1986, and I'm skipping things that I should mention, but maybe somebody mentions them, I'll answer them. But I'm focusing on the major changes because in 1986, as I'm sure most of you have already read about, because I'm sure that many people that are accompanying us are too young to remember this, but in 1986, the US Congress approved a reform known as IRCA, IRCA, which means Immigration Control Reform and Control Act, the law to control and reform to control migratory reform. Curiously, in our agenda, the Latin American people, what we most remember is one of the three parts of this law. It's just the part that had to do with offering a way to surpass the living in undocumented condition to request a conditioned visa, which after 2 years after living as a conditioned resident, you could request your visa as a permanent resident. And at the end of the day, a little over 3 million people were able to obtain their permanent resident visa through this IRCA component. But what people don't remember is that there were two additional components in the law. The component that restricted the right to work, because the idea they had back then was that if that they were forbidden or made very, very difficult for the employers to employ people that were undocumented, people would stop arriving. But besides this, they also took the decision for the first time in the most recent era of the immigration policy. They began to work on the idea that if we strengthen the level of border patrols and we became extremely terrified, so that people would not want to cross the border without permission, it would also stop people from crossing over. Obviously, this didn't work because even back then, there was an estimate of 4 to 5 million people undocumented, but only over 3 million people were able to request and obtain the condition of being a permanent resident. This was the last moment in which the US law changed in a way that, I repeat, offered a clear path so that people could request permanent resident visas and surpass the condition of living in an undocumented condition. Several years later, the change is dramatic in the opposite direction. And this was not an accident, because this had to do that organizations, political forces that were highly motivated by white supremacist ideas, by hatred towards foreigners, promoted in a consistent fashion the idea that migration was something bad for the country, and that the migrant, specifically the Mexicans, and the rest of us who look like Mexicans, were a type of cancer for the country. So in 1996, a law is approved, which I think you all know them by their acronym, IRA, which is basically the the illegal immigration law reform. The goal was to quote unquote surpass the social phenomenon of the unauthorized presence of foreign people within the US, and to make the foreign people responsible. As you can see, the idea is that all of us were irresponsible, so we had to become even more responsible. This law, approved in September of 1996 during a Democratic government, the Bill Clinton government, I didn't mention it, but the change in 1986 was the Ronald Reagan, who was a Republican president. This 1986 law is still the law that is still currently valid in the US. It's a law that has a wide variety of measures that are not only punitive, but also restrictive and excluding. So these are the three great criteria that this law picks up. The idea to reduce rights for foreign people, exclude people, and there are several categories are created to exclude people to have access to a permanent resident visa, and also punishes for those who dare to break the law. All of this has created the conditions that has allowed the governments after the one that was in power back then in 1996 to promote actions like the ones done by Barack Obama in his 8 years that he was in power, that in concrete generated terrible human pain. We have to remember that there were over 3 million people that were deported. The majority of them were Mexican, which are removed from the country. And as a matter of fact, many of them were penalized with the possibility to return in the future because they were quote unquote recurring people. People have been arrested more than once for living there. So they have been deported and they come back and they're deported yet again, but now with a lifetime prohibition to return to the US. This is related with the other topic we're going to mention in the conversation, which has to do with parole in place, which is precisely before 1986. I'm not saying that the law was generous by any means, but it contained many other elements, many other clauses that in practice allowed that every year a relatively small number but significant number of people could surpass the condition of living in the US without permission and were able to obtain the status of a permanent resident. I'm just mentioning one program that has a lot of importance, which is something known as, until 1986, as the deportation suspension, which in essence means that if you were arrested by migration, but you could prove that you had lived for 7 years in the US and that you were a person with a good moral character, which a person that was not involved in any type of clearly criminal action, you could obtain this benefit, which would allow you to obtain the permanent resident status. So this benefit was by the law of 1996, and it was replaced by something that's very different, which is known as the removal cancellation, which has nothing to do with the condition of the migrant per se, but instead, if your presence in the United States was going to cause harm to a person that economically depends on you to be a citizen, it could be your spouse, it could be your children, but your situation as a resident, it's not relevant, which is, I repeat, is a dramatic change compared to what was in effect prior to 1996. And I want to finalize just explaining that without a doubt, the foreign people that that have mostly been penalized by this entire shift, by the migratory change in the US, have been the Mexican people, almost all of them, followed by, of course, of all the Latin American nationalities and from the Caribbean. And this should not surprise us because if we take a look at the composition of the population that lives in the US, but that was born outside in the last 35, 40 years, we're going to find out that the majority of these foreigners are Mexican people from Central America, Dominican, from Haiti, Cuban people, and recently, as we've seen in the changes, migratory flows, people that come from South America, in particular from Venezuela. So I hope that you had responded to your questions. Yes, well, it's a very broad question, and you almost began with question number two. If you could briefly, with regards to what influences, what what gives life, what are these factors that determines that the migratory policy in the US is the way it is. You already mentioned ideological issues like the xenophobic factors, but there's also economic factor. But it's good to understand it because this allows us to better inform ourselves when you find it in a campaign or efforts that seek a migratory relief. Well, this question is very important because it allows us to refresh my memory regarding a specific aspect of the migratory law, which we frequently forget, which is the migratory policy. In other words, the way the United States that throughout history has regulated throughout laws who can arrive in the US. That is pretty much is the what the migratory policy addresses, the rules through which a person can arrive into the United States. It's an area of the policy that is completely dependent on the fundamental criteria that is directed by the United States foreign policy. The migratory policy, many of us think that it's a policy that's quote unquote domestic, but in reality, it was conceived as an extension, as an addendum to the foreign policy. And this from this principle, the fact is derived that who determines the immigration policy, in other words, who decides who is going to be allowed to arrive in the US, it's the federal government. The state governments do not have that faculty up to now. Nobody has challenged it so far. That might change in the future, but up to now, everybody knows that the topic when it comes to the migratory condition for a foreign person is defined by the federal government. And this makes us see that determining who we're going to allow entry and who we're not going to allow entry definitely passes through a filter with regards to the interests of the United States that are reflected on who is arriving or who is going to be allowed entry into the US. I'm going to place another example so that anybody who is younger than 45, 50 years might not remember this, but throughout history, especially after World War II, there was an effort, a deliberate effort to allow the United States to permit the entry of people that had arrived literally, allegedly, that were fleeing from the monster of communism, in the framework of the Cold War. And why was this happening? Because allowing people from Poland, people from other countries from the Eastern Europe, from Cuba, would reinforce the foreign policy for the US to make it see the countries from the former communist bloc to be seen as demons. This also explained why, if you were coming from a country that was considered an ally from the US, you were still being persecuted. Even if you were persecuted in your country, it wasn't that easy to find support and protection in the US. In the 70s, we saw many examples, but there's specifically the case of the Chilean people that arrived after the upheaval of Salvador Allende's government, which wasn't that easy for them to be welcomed in the US. And the same pattern was repeated in the 80s with the Central American people. But I also want to point out that in the way the US migratory policy has been ordered, there has been severe economic interest for many people that we have seen throughout the years, and for those of us who analyze the migratory policy, it's very difficult to imagine that the presence of more than 10 million undocumented people in the US could be an accident. In other words, we should have to distinguish that the presence of so many people, especially working people, which are estimated between 8 to 9 million people who are in their prime working without authorization within the US, it's a huge bonus that makes this policy of unauthorized Because
corporativos, los
for
sectores
the corporate interest, the economic interest of the US, and I'm talking about different sectors of the US economy that have benefited from having a job market of millions of people who are willing to work in docile and repressed conditions precisely because of the fear that if they lose the job that they have, they're going to lose the way their means to provide for their families. So this, economically speaking, I repeat, it's a bonus for different sectors in the job market. The most well-known are obviously the agriculture sector in the US that simply could not function without foreign manual labor that they've relied on for decades now. The service sector, where obviously there's a foreign presence, unauthorized foreign presence, which is quite large, etc. So these are the factors that direct, that have a weight when it comes to determining what to do and what not to do. And I want to finalize the answer to this question, Janita, by pointing out what has happened since the end of the 70s onwards, because in addition to the factors that I already mentioned, there's also the presence of foreign people in the country being there without authorization as a social subject that is valuable to the effects of the electoral policy in the measure that to the extent that the campaign of terror and fear towards foreign people, the way they are mistreated, the foreign people are mistreated, it becomes also a tool, a powerful political tool. And we have to remember, and it's something ironic, and maybe young people are not aware of this or don't remember this, but curiously, during the most recent era, the last 3+ decades, it turns out that the most important experiment for the political and electoral benefits to demonize, to dehumanize the migrant Mexican and Latin American person, Asian and African person, it becomes valid precisely in California within the framework of the 1994 elections, where a governmental electoral campaign was basically dead. It's reborn, and who comes out victorious thanks to the demonization and dehumanization of foreign people. And it's also proved in that campaign of 1994, one of the first anti-immigrant laws that would officialize the mistreatment for foreign people. It was so preposterous that it became invalidated in its majority by the Supreme Court because it violated the US Constitution. Obviously, who have promoted this electoral political tool, of course, they've learned their lessons and they've been improving the way how the anti-immigrant laws are redacted so that what happened in California in 1984 does not happen again. And also omitting a few other things, I have to mention that Donald Trump, it's the first time that within a presidential campaign uses the anti-foreign topic as the most potent topic to appeal to the emotional side of the electoral voters. We're in a condition that is propense to be manipulated from the worst feelings that we human beings might feel to unload their frustration and their anger towards these foreign people. I'm going to remind you, in case you forgot, that the day in which Donald Trump announced his desire to run as a candidate in 2015 in New York, he does it by visually attacking precisely the Mexican immigrants, accusing them of all type of terrible things without any shred of evidence, since there was nothing to back up what he was saying. And in this sense, the electrical topic and the use and perverse manipulation of the worst feelings that a human being might have it also becomes a motivating factor when it comes to determining the immigration policy. This explains the positioning of the Republican Party, but also the positioning that the Democratic Party has been taking, where they frequently try to fool us when there's what they say, but in practice,
De manera que
the
sea
narrative or the laws do not change in a way that the experience might be beneficial for those immigrant and especially the undocumented people within the US. Thank you, Oscar, for your opinions and your comments. And I'm inviting everybody to use the question and answer option so that we can receive your question with regards to this first part of the conversation with Oscar Chacón. We hope that this brief introduction has helped our audience to also understand why we transitioned to the other question that has to do with now what? 10 years ago, the central demand regarding migratory policy for many groups and which are present in this that were defending the rights of the immigrant people that were receiving a permanent resident visa for people that have spent many years living in the US. Currently, the struggle has focused on asking that the White House uses its power to protect certain populations from deportation, whether it's through TPS and other programs such as DACA, the people that arrive, the deferred obligatory action, which it's another protective measure such as the TPS, but it depends on the discretion of the US government. The Biden-Harris administration has given TPS to other countries. Several countries have received extensions or new designations, but also designated countries that previously didn't have TPS, like for example, Haiti, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Honduras, Nepal, Syria, Yemen, South Sudan, and South Sudan, but countries that never had TPS and are able to access it in this administration, such as Cameroon, Venezuela, Afghanistan, among other countries. Venezuela has been the only country, Latin American country, that received the TPS designation for over 20 years. No other country in Latin America has received, and we're talking about this administration or the previous ones from Latin America. In the face of this context that is highly plagued by a very toxic narrative, a political scenario that is not favorable in the Congress, and in the midst of an electrical battle, the question for you, Oscar, is what factors could play an influence over the decisions of President Biden for what is left in his presidency? And a follow-up question is, what should we expect in the future of what's left in Biden's presidency and for the next 4 years, depending on who wins with regards to administrative reliefs? Well, first of all, point out that our Haitian brothers and sisters have received protection. And I mentioned Haiti because when I talk about Latin America, I do it from a perspective, an inclusive perspective of everything that is not United States and Canada, of course. So these are the Venezuelans and Haitians, the two groups that we have classically called Latin America, including the Caribbean, who have received protection. And we have to be frank about this. There is a huge difference regarding why Haitians receive protection and why Venezuelans receive this protection. But both of them have to do with a foreign policy and have to do with a domestic policy, because it's not an accident why these two groups have received it, but the Nicaraguans or Guatemalans, Salvadorians, and Hondurans and Mexicans receive it. My apologies. So, and I also want to make the most of your question to briefly comment two things that I think have drastically changed in the last 25 years, give or take. The first of all is that until the beginning of the aughts of the year 2000 onwards, I can definitely say that there were definitely Republicans that had an interest in solving the migratory issue because of a certain degree of decency and basic human decency and ethics. The most highlighted case of Republicans that were committed to this idea was Senator John McCain. But also, to be honest, the same president, George W. Bush, who is, you can criticize him for a million other reasons, he had postures that were relatively reasonable when it comes to the potential to changes in the when it comes to the changes in the migratory law. This is a past that is far behind for quite some time. What happens at the end of that decade, 2009, 2010, is that there's a dramatic change. And in the Republican Party, we are basically, it's the Republican Party, those few voices, regional voices, are substituted by voices that are much more submitted to the dominating line within the Republican Party that we know nowadays, which is Donald Trump's Republican Party. It's a Republican Party that is committed to a vision of white supremacy, extremist when it comes to the way they treat foreigners, and sees migration as a threat to the nation's identity. This is important to take into consideration because what they've been telling us almost as a litany, and it might sometimes almost sounds religious, is that the only way to obtain a change in the law is through bipartisan proposals. So the question is, how can it obtain reasonable bipartisan proposals that generally seek to favor the well-being of migrant people and repropose migration for the US throughout the important role that migrants play in the well-being of the country, when in the Republican side, the counterpart, and including some Democrats, are not at all voices that can truly tell us that are motivated by ethical and moral values that generally characterize human beings in good. That's something that we have to take in. This is something we have to keep in mind. We don't have that much time to discuss it, but it's important to keep in mind because the second aspect that has been pointed out throughout the last 25 years is the idea that what the country needs is a comprehensive migratory reform. And this idea of a comprehensive migratory reform has caused us to have us where we are right now, which is we don't have anything that we can say that because of a change of law, the lives of millions and millions of foreigners has changed in a way that they can obtain access to permanent resident visas. So this has caused, Janita, a reality that is very miserable, where the most we can aspire to is administrative changes that at the same time it has cost a long time for them to be granted. I'm going to
En el año 2009, cuando llega
remind those that are here on the call, when Obama enters power in 2009, organizations such as Alianza Americas were one of the few ones that would insist the recently named president to use the powers that he had to grant temporary protection, because we knew that by presidential actions, we couldn't change the migratory status of the people, but definitely the presidency does have powers to improve the life conditions, to relieve the life conditions for the families that live undocumented within the US. And Obama consistently denied having that opportunity, that authority, until he was struck in the midst of his re-electoral campaign in 2012, and he grants DACA. But I repeat, he constantly denied he had that authority until it was convenient because of his re-election campaign. And this brings us to Biden. Biden, without a doubt, has been a president and administration that has touched upon his administrative powers in a subtle fashion. And, for example, it is true that this administration is the one that has done the most TPS designation has done, that created more paths for people to arrive to the US without having to do it without documents and crossing the border illegally. But they've done it with much care. For example, in the case of Central America, which is precisely when Biden reaches power in 2021, he had all the powers to give new assignations of DACA because of the impact caused in Central America because of tropical storms. There was a whole list of justifications to do so, but they didn't do so because of the fear that the administration could be portrayed as an administration, as a soft-handed administration when it comes to undocumented people living in the US. They did it for other national groups, and that's good that they do it. But speaking in numbers, they've been very far away from providing protection to a large number of people. The exception would be the case of Venezuela. And I repeat, there's a separate logic of why they do it with Venezuela, but not with other Latin American nationalities. The case of Mexico is the most unfortunate ones because they're still the national group that's most affected by because of they live in the US without documents. Mexico could perfectly be built as a case for whether it's a deferred action or a TPS because of the reasons of violence and insecurity that are rampant throughout Mexico, but they haven't done it because of the lack of decision, because of the lack of value, political value, and courage to do so. This makes me think that the best that we can expect between now and the end of the Biden administration, which would end during the first days of January of 2025, is the implementation, a positive implementation that is a implementation that is very agile of this announcement about a month and a half ago of a program known as Parole in Place. It's possible, but to be honest, I don't think it's likely that we're going to see new TPS designations between now and the end of the Biden administration. And I think that the big task that we have with organizations such as the ones that we are housed here in Alianza America and other ones is to keep demanding to address the evidence, which is focused on the truth and the evidence, this campaign of lies and dehumanization against our communities that have no sustainable basis, including this idiotic argument that we immigrants worsen the crime rates in the US. It's simply not true. Now, the next 4 years, Janita, I think that will depend on who turns out triumphant in the campaign, in the electoral voting in November 2024. Now, if Donald Trump gets another presidency, we're going to be on the defensive completely to try to maintain what little we have right now, because the intention is going to be eliminate everything, close everything. Trump himself has said it many times. They want to, that the very first day, they want to begin a massive deportation campaign of people that live in the US without authorization. And this does not discount the possibility that they're going to go against people that are currently have some limited fragile margin of protection. And by this I mean the DACA and TPS beneficiaries, because these are the people that the names and directions people they most recently have. So we have to suspect that this might occur. So if on November 5th, the person that wins is a Democratic Party, well, I think that what opens is a possibility that we can begin from the moment that they are elected, they can begin with pressure with even more force than we've done before so they can begin using, on one hand, the administrative party that they have, power that they have, in a more aggressive and assertive fashion, and at the same time, if they had the relation of forces in their favor, like imagining that the Democratic Party controls the Senate and controls the House of Representatives, we would have to demand with a lot of precision the type of change in law that we want to be approved. And the possibilities are open. Maybe the solution has not been, as we said in the past, a comprehensive reform, but at least a series of key reforms that will help the life for the undocumented person and the people in the future are going to keep looking to arrive in the US will be something that will be in a context of appreciation and acknowledgement of the huge positive value that the immigrant person and the migration itself has meant and will continue meaning for the United States of America. Thank you, Oscar, for that reflection. And for those of you who have been sending questions, there's some questions regarding TPS for Ecuador and Colombia. You talked about this somewhat, but in the question and answer, we can also touch upon it again. But we're now going to open the floor to our colleague, Elena Olea, our program vice director, so that she can continue with this next part of the agenda. Thank you, Janita. Good morning to everybody. I'm aware of the current time. I know that we're a bit behind on our agenda, but we're trying to make the effort of covering many topics to better. I think that understanding the story is important in order to reflect on what is happening. As many of you know, and as the government announced, what was established was the Parole in Place program. It was a recent measure and the laws were recently announced, and it's a measure that we estimate it's going to benefit around 500,000 people. I placed in the chat that is available for all of you a document that we prepared in Alianza Americas, and we can share once again at the end of today's meeting with all the people that were registered and letting you know about how Parole in Place works. The restrictions that it has when it comes to people, from when they should be present in the country, from when they should have a legal marriage, and how this measure benefits the children of these people. Because of time, I want to begin with two specific questions regarding Parole in Place. The first one has to do with Parole in Place was announced when the candidate was Joe Biden. When that was the proposal from the Democratic Party, it's interesting to measure how the is presented under the Protection for Families, under that banner. So the question would be, what doors would you consider are open under this great title of Protection for Families, and how could we try to advance this idea to obtain more protections or more reliefs and hopefully more measures, more effective and permanent solutions? Well, and first of all, what I want to point out is that the topic of what is now known as Parole in Place is specifically one example of demands that were proposed, as I mentioned previously, in January of 2009. As well, I think that it was still during the transition period. Obama hadn't taken power yet in order to move on from the Bush government to the Obama government, when organizations such as ours presented a series of proposals of programs that should have been placed into effect precisely to alleviate the situation for foreign people as a consequence of what the change in the law from 1996. Many of you might not remember or don't know, but one of the many contents from the migratory law of 1996 was the creation of what is now known as the re-entry prohibitions from people from 3 to 10 years old, which in the majority of the cases are 10 years old, or of 10 years, because what this re-entry prohibition, what it means is that if you lived in the US just one day, if you lived undocumented within the US, you have a prohibition of 3 years. But if you live 180 days or more in the US without documents, we're talking 6 months, that prohibition became 10 years. So they caused that many foreign people that can request a permanent resident visa because they're married with a US citizen, they consciously decided not to do so because they don't want to face that potential of being divided from their loved ones for such a long time. What Pro in Place concretely offers, and it's an example of many things that could be done if who is in the position of making these decisions is wants to favor foreign people, these undocumented people. Much more could be done, but what parole in place allows is that the spouse of a U.S. citizen and has a permanent a permanent resident visa request that entered the country without documents, which means that the re-entry prohibition applies to the person, it will no longer apply because this could occur within the US. So the person would not face the re-entry prohibition, since just like this case, there are many other cases that you could also look to favor. There are many people that have stated the importance of the people who are also citizens or residents of the US, that they don't have this status, that could potentially be benefited from something of this nature if someone once again applies their imagination with a good intention, a genuine desire to help. Much more could be done. How about a program, a deferred action program for any person that has lived 3 or more years in the US but without documents? The possibilities of this nature, I repeat, they exist. Parole in place exemplifies that it can be done, but it requires, I insist, a lot of courage, a lot of desire to face who's going to criticize you for doing something like this. And this is where we've had a serious problem, because there has been no political willingness so that programs such as Parole in Place are not only made valid and take effect, but see ways to increase them. So I insist, Parole in Place gives this benefit. It's a very warranted benefit. There's no reason why to punish a person, the spouse of a US citizen, with a forced exit for that much time. So, in my opinion, I repeat, Parole in Place exemplifies the good that can be done when there's a genuine willingness to help. Yes, Oscar, and I think that's precisely, you mentioned this topic, but it's worth repeating to think about what happens to people that cannot request parole in place, that they did not fall in love with a US citizen, but instead they fell in love with a person that just like them, they're in the same irregular migratory status, but they created their life, they have their family, and they want to stay here. Well, once again, I don't know how many of you have heard the speeches of the Democratic Convention, several of these speeches, where, including Barack Obama's speech, these are speeches that are assertive in the sense that they talk about living with dignity if you're a human being. So there should be no reason why we should exclude foreign people from this. And we've also talked a lot about the value of respecting the topic of who is your spouse and why this person is your spouse. And in this sense, this love, this codependency that exists between two people that love each other, that, as a matter of fact, get married, it's something that we don't acknowledge as something that's valued. and we especially don't recognize it when we talk about foreign people. So I would insist in pointing out that if there were the political willingness that convince people that have the ability to take decisions, such as a US president, other mechanisms could be created which would be directed to recognize and value and appreciate the incredibly how beneficial migration is for the US. And for example, and to provide a legal space for people that have lived in this country for 3 years. And I'm not only talking about specifically 3 years. I want to go back a minute to 1986. The 1986 reform had two mechanisms so that people could request permanent residency eventually, even if at first what they received was conditioned residency. The first avenue to arrive there is to demonstrate that they will still arrive to the US at the very latest December 31st, 1981. 1982, 83, 84, 85, 86. So basically 5 years of continuous residency that you had to show in order to present a request for conditioned residency, which I repeat, took you to permanent residency. But I remind you, 1986, the immigrant population was much smaller. The Latin American population was much smaller than it is right now. And back then, we didn't represent the economic and social value that we now represent. This is why the way I see things, going back 3 years is the very least that we should do in order to obtain that the US provides relief. Even so, if it's not a ticket to arrive
a la residencia
period
permanente.
eventually to permanent residency. Because here, I insist, we're still stuck by the problem that to determine the mechanism through which you become a person that has a visa, immigrant visa, known as the permanent resident visa, to have a green card, as it's sometimes known, it's the US Congress. So that cannot be determined only by executive branch of the government. So at least until this day, even we've spoken with people that you can do it. So I think it's an element that we have to explore with more attention. But I repeat, at the very minimum, the Biden government and the coming government, they're making almost, it's a fact that they won't have both houses under their control. They could absolutely issue more protection mechanisms for people that I insist are and are going to continue being a blessing for this country. So I think that the opportunities are large. What we have to work on is how to build the political willingness. And this is something for all people, not just people that are citizens or have documents in the US. All of us can collaborate on in the most precise way to progress in the construction of the necessary political willingness. Thank you, Oscar, and thanks to the entire audience because you've made many interesting questions. So I'm gonna ask you to give very concise answers because we know that we're reaching the end of the program. So we're gonna begin with one specific question. The question is, in the face of an eventual triumph of the Democratic Party, how can we cause pressure for favorable pressure in a more effective way than compared to how we're doing it now? I think that there are at least 2 or 3 conditions. First of all, to be clear about what we want. And when I say clear about what we want, this is not reduced to just one word. Somebody can say documents, but we have to be sophisticated regarding the question of what we want in order to do it in a clear way. And of course, ambitiously. Second of all, get ourselves organized. At the end of the day, everything has to do with political power. And this political power comes as a result of how organized you are as a group. Nobody's gonna nobody's gonna give you power for free. Nobody's going to offer it to you without you asking for it. And to do this requires for us to be better organized. Only in the last 3 years, over 500,000 Venezuelans have entered the US. How many of these are actively looking to organize themselves in order to create influence? Not talking about Mexicans or the other Latin Americans and the rest of the immigrants. The third thing, which I think is absolutely necessary, is to build alliances. We're not going to reach everything that we want by ourselves. We have to do the work to persuade with those that we work with us within the spheres of government that we work with, which is not just the federal government. We as immigrant people, we live in specific locations, specific cities. We live in specific states. If we can begin to mobilize not only as many allies as possible, so they can join the chorus of voices demanding for sensible solutions, I think we're going to be in a better condition to cause pressure to a Democratic or a potential president in Kamala Harris to do the correct thing, not only administrative plane, but also in causing changes in the law. Thank you, Oscar. We can think that there is an opportunity with regards to the undocumented parents of children. Something that has been the chat in programs such as when it comes to the years that it covers, it is likely. Absolutely, yes. I think that at the end of the day, if something that we have to learn from the Republicans at a municipal level, federal and state level, is that these people are very creative regarding how to use the current law to advance with what they want. On the opposite side, we've become too shy and we've lost our political willingness in order to obtain protection for the people, protection for the parents of people who have documents. It's a legitimate demand. It's like talking about the case of groups such as the farm workers. Every year there are studies that show the high percentage of undocumented workers in the agriculture sector. Why haven't we done anything for them? So I think that to continue saying, oh, we have to wait for there to be a comprehensive reform, this is where I think we have to be pragmatic and learn from other struggles. I've said it many times in public, the struggle for the rights of people, for the lesbian people, for transsexual people, homosexual people, those that normally we group together in LGBTQ plus, this is very valuable people. These people have never said, give me everything or don't give me everything at all. What they actually did was they fought for everything, but they welcomed anything that moved them. There was just an inch, always in the correct direction. So as immigrants, as organizations that fight for our rights, we have to learn from these and other groups that have gotten organized next to us with regards to how do we conquer benefits that bear tangible benefits to our people, not just the promise of that in a specific day we're going to receive everything at all. No, we have to fight for things to get them now. Oscar, and thinking about specific groups, what is to be expected for people with DACA? Well, I think that in the case of DACA, we have to remember that when parole in place was announced, there was also an announcement that for the possibility that people that benefit from DACA were going to receive the benefit of temporary work visas in the H-1B category, which is a mechanism that is available to people that are living outside the US. the process has not been defined in detail. It's a small thing. We have to be aware of this. We're not talking about 500,000 people are going to benefit from H-1B in 1 year, but it gives us a clue of things that can be done that don't also imply changing the law. Instead, changing how the current law is applied. Currently, we have a problem, and there's a numeric limit of how many permanent US visas can be granted for one particular nationality. These are the things that we have to be seeing how we can change them if we want to give visibility to solutions for people that have been living in the US for decades. I'm not only talking about the DACA beneficiaries, there are also TPS beneficiaries that have been here for over 20 years in a temporary condition, paying periodically for their work permits that have the same or more merit than the DACA beneficiaries, and we rarely talk about this. So I think it's also important to have that in mind, that we have to find not only within the current law, but also the potential of specific changes in the law that will solve the issue for people like the DACA beneficiaries and the TPS beneficiaries throughout the years. And I want to insist, Elena, on the importance of not tying down on comprehensive migratory reform, but also go to the legislative plane from a more flexible logic. I'm the first person interested in there being a positive comprehensive law reform for immigrants, not the comprehensive law they tried to sell in 2007, 2013 that had thousands of problems, because even if it did give a few things, it took away many other things. So it's important to not lose track of this, but we're not going to reach paradise from one day to another. We have to go little by little towards where we want to go. Yes, I think you've insisted on that point, which is very important. Instead of going for everything right away, we have to go step by step. We talked about people that already have some benefit, but in the chat, they keep asking about the people that don't have it. What hopes are there for Ecuadorian people that have TPS or the program for Colombia? Is there a window of opportunity between now and the elections? Between now and the elections, my apologies, and I might be mistaken, but I discussed it directly with colleagues from Ecuador and Colombia. I think it's very, very difficult, to be honest, that this administration is going to stray from the path that they've set so far. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it's very difficult for there to be protection concessions in DDE or TPS for these people from these countries. But I think it's imperative to work on auto organization, to be clear on what we want, which I mentioned the first point, and third, to mobilize all allies as possible. I think that the experience we've had in Alianza, working specifically with African and Central American communities, it's very important to know why we get organized. Curiously, the work with these communities from several years ago had a triggering effect to look for TPS for groups from Central America, and specifically those that come from the Central Africa. But during the organization process, we realized that being better organized, it means we could do things much better within the municipal, local councils, within the state representatives, and we've obtained important advances. We haven't obtained TPS for these groups, but we have improved the capability to do things throughout alliance construction of alliances, and identify what other things would help us walk in the correct direction, which would allow us to be better prepared in case we obtain a victory, even if it's a victory just to obtain so people can have work permits. That we know that our people deserve much, much more than this, but it is an important change if we can obtain this. So I repeat, continue advancing and betting on constructing political willingness. It's crucial. Yes, and I want to recognize a question in the chat, which I think is something that we're seeing much more of. It's that the people that had the work permit that have been contributing to Social Security, the country's social security, but don't have no expectation, and they won't be able to claim the right when they retire. I think it's a topic that requires a longer discussion than the one we have now. Dolores, the idea is that we're going to address this. We're aware of this topic, and to finalize, I would like to collect you with an invitation down by Marsha Brown. It's the importance of voting and participating, those who can do it. Those of us who can't vote, to help convince those who can't do so. And I would like to ask you, what is that final call? What is that last thing that we can do for those who can't?
Todos aquí hemos escuchado seguramente
Those of us who have heard that accusation, that basis accusation that guarantee that people that have voted in the past and are going to vote in this election in November, which is completely false. The few cases have been detected have been accidents or misunderstandings, but not a deliberate campaign to obtain this. Having said that, I think it's absolutely crucial that we seek it within our family circles, within our circles of friends, and we do a better work educating people, because I also have to say, I have to be frank about this. I have known Latin American friends that are talking things, ridiculous things like supporting Trump. We have to educate our loved ones, our friends, our relatives that they have the possibility of voting, so that they do it from knowing exactly which option is the most convenient, or if you want to see it in this way, the one that presents the less threat to us, because without a doubt, there's a huge difference between one candidate that says that he's going to go against undocumented foreigners from the very first day of his government,
bien no nos está
and the
ofreciendo
candidate that, even if she's not offering heaven and the stars, is open so that we can have discussions regarding this. I insist, I'm completely clear. Neither of these options inspires much, but even so, it gives a clear possibility of improving the capability to change. It's and this is not, I'm not doing campaigning in favor of anybody. I'm just saying, simply stating what the campaigns of both of these candidates have said. Thank you very much, Oscar. We went 15 minutes over the hour. We can obviously keep discussing. There are questions and there's interest, and it's important to have a historic vision of the evolution or devolution of the migratory policy in the US. It's crucial to see this step by step. It's useful to discuss these strategies and these prospects. It's going to be a period of a lot of work before the elections, and without a doubt, to prepare us for the administration that will come into power in January, in one sense or the other. On the part of Alianza Americas, we're going to continue convening for these spaces for reunion and reflection. Today's conversation will be available in the Alianza Americas YouTube channel. We're going to share it with the people that assisted to today's meeting, so you can share it with other people. And we're also going to share the parole in place document that we made available, and that will be available, so you can also share it with other people. The conversations regarding this topic continue, and we thank every one of you for your attention and your presence today. Thank you very much, Oscar. Thank you very much, Janita. No, thank you. We're going to continue with this.